Hello, Professor Sanchez and fellow students. Like many of you this week, I'm excited to present my analysis and synthesis of organizational change concepts covered within this semester's assigned reading, found in Organizational Change Theory and Practice by W. Warner Burke. My name is Thomas James, and I'm a graduate student with Amberton University pursuing my degree in professional development and a concurrent specialization in change management. I am pleased to present to you an organizational transformation effort of which I am very much a part of. Hence, this will be a very practical application of this semester's learning. The title of this presentation is Transforming Organizations, Guiding Hierarchical Structural Changes Through Employment of the Burke-Letwin Model. Today my agenda will cover the issue statement and thesis, the hypothesis and central question, overview of the Air Reserve Technician Program as it relates to my organization, characteristics of federal bureaucracy, climate and cultural implications, the Burke-Letwin change methodology, and assessments of results. Beginning in February 2014, the Air Force Reserve elected to reduce 14 administrative positions within the Air Reserve Technician Program as part of a broader workforce reduction initiative. The decision to remove these positions was strategically guided. However, little coordination was accomplished at the squadron level, which is the lowest echelon within the Air Force Reserve that I will discuss in my presentation. On October 1, 2016, no less than 12 squadrons began sharing administrative personnel and tasks as a result. My focus today is to describe my organizational change effort as it relates to just 2 squadrons, which I am actively managing as a result of this decision. Somewhat complicating matters, this organizational change effort largely affects every reserve airman within these 2 organizations, who drill once a month and perform annual training 15 days out of every year. But the crux of this change management will be described within a small but very capable portion of these 2 organizations, which is composed of Air Reserve technicians. These are employees who are considered a full-time workforce, which I will cover in greater detail for you. It is key for me to note that prior to this October, these 2 organizations maintained 2 distinct administrative teams comprised of both full-time and part-time personnel that enabled the daily human resource administrative workload of their assigned units. In this function, they are what is referred to as Command Section Support, or CSSs. That said, my thesis proposal for you today is Burke-Letwin's causal model of organizational performance and change could be used as an organizational climate indicator because human processual interventions do not exist. Incentivizing work may be construed as unethical, and military organizations are predominantly mission-focused. During the pre-launch phase of this organizational change, 2 common concerns were identified. First, the command section support teams will have at least 60% additional workload with no apparent performance study scheduled to validate the intensification of effort and work needed. Secondly, without consolidating the CSS personnel within a higher echelon, a high probability of disharmony will exist within the 2 organizations if performance begins to lag and a perception of persistent increased support to only one organization occurs. Presently, the command section support teams will be consolidated within only one of the 2 organizations. This is the expectation that the other organization will provide coordinators to ensure communication flow and direct coordination to their unit's manpower. The expectation is realistic and already realized because many of the organizations experiencing this pending consolidation never had a full complement of CSS personnel to begin with. So workload shifted to other organizational teams not commonly associated with human resource focus. Moreover, the consolidation of this CSS capability to a higher echelon might prove to be problematic due to no management requirement existing for CSS functionality at the next higher echelon. Therefore, no staff manager is currently in place to assume this role. From a time-bound perspective, this consolidated effort is viewed as indefinite. A plan for implementation of this consolidation exists and has already been agreed to all stakeholders and supervisors. For background, the Air Reserve Technician Program was established to provide reserve unit management and training continuity. In 1967, the Air Reserve Technician Program improved during significant reforms implemented within the Air Force Reserve. By 1973, a Total Force Initiative mandate was established which enabled the coordinated programming, planning, and training to occur between active duty organizations and Air Reserve organizations. Air Reserve Technicians, or ARTs as we're sometimes referred to as, are dual status employees. Although they are federal employees, they are required to maintain a military affiliation, typically with the same organization of their military assignment. Also, they must wear the military uniform during the work week. What is interesting at times is managing the technical, political, and cultural differences of the ART program and the military unit to which we are assigned. As these two organizations organize and train for an intelligence mission, the performance management is based on the Defense Civilian Intelligence Personnel System. As a segment of the federal workforce, Air Reserve Technicians' role to society is primarily bureaucratic. Modern bureaucracies may best be described by Max Weber, a political economist who studied these organizations throughout much the latter half of the 19th century. In 1922, he wrote Economy and Society, in which he crafted 5 characteristics of bureaucracy, which are still very relevant today. These characteristics are hierarchical organization. The structure of a bureaucracy is called a hierarchy, a succession of tiers from the most menial worker in an organization to the highest executive. Each level has clearly defined levels of authority and responsibility. Professionalism, intended to be both a social system but also capable of providing quality goods and services to the public. Formality, or formal rules. Bureaucracies function under formal rules. These instructions state how all tasks within an organization or a particular tier within the hierarchy are to be performed. The rules are often called standard operating procedures and are formalized in manuals. By following the rules, bureaucrats waste no time in making appropriate decisions. Record keeping. Weber's explanation here shifts with technology and the times. What remains relevant today still is record keeping is an understandable and shared communication. Record keeping is also accessible through transparency, but limited by a need to know. Specialization. This characteristic giving more to knowledge, skills, and abilities associated with a particular organizational role, but bound by a rigid limitation of personal responsibility, expertise, and doctrine. What is particularly telling in Weber's research is that he considered bureaucracies to be threatening to individual freedoms, yet important enough for their function to improve society. He viewed this need as a rationalization, where motives for employee behaviors were not left only to wages, but more predominantly values and traditions. More so as a functionalist, Weber assigned positional status as a measure for privileged learning and knowledge. As I shared with you in my introduction to Air Reserve Technician, those employed in my organization use the Defense Civilian Intelligence Personnel System, or DCIPS. Within this system are characteristics important to ART culture. According to the DCIPS Guide to Writing Effective Performance Objectives, Self-Accomplishment, and Evaluations for Employees and Rating Officials, DCIPS performance culture is synonymous with the overarching goal of effective performance management, to improve performance and boost results that are driven by the mission. Key to the Defense Civilian Intelligence Personnel System is embracing performance and behaviors that are conducive to innovation, collaboration, and teamwork. Contributing to the cultural expectations of employees within the 38th Intelligence Squadron, to which I belong, all 7 performance elements that are agreed to by both the employee and supervisor during annual performance planning, midpoint performance review, and annual performance closeout, a process that will generate a performance score used to compete for monetary incentive. Depending on the employee's positional responsibilities, including supervisor or management expectations, no more than 6 performance elements include accountability for results, measures that extend to which your employee takes responsibility for his or her own work, sets or meets priorities, and uses time and resources to achieve desired results. Communication, measures the extent to which your employee is able to comprehend or convey information with and from others in writing, reading, listening, and verbal or nonverbal action. Critical thinking measures the employee's ability to use logic, analysis, synthesis, creativity, judgment, and process approaches to gather and evaluate multiple sources of information. Engagement and collaboration measures the extent of which an employee promotes engagement, collaboration, integration, and the sharing of information and knowledge. Personal leadership and integrity measures the extent of which your employee is able to demonstrate personal initiative, honesty, openness, and respect. Technical expertise measures the employee's ability to acquire and apply knowledge, subject matter expertise in tradecraft, and/or technical competency necessary to achieve results. Leadership measures the extent to which your employees are able to demonstrate personal initiative, honesty, openness, and respect in dealing with coworkers, peers, customers, and stakeholders. And finally, managerial proficiency. This is a measure of employees' proficiency of his or her mission area appropriate to their role as a supervisor and manager. To best describe the organizational climate for our Air Reserve technicians, which I'm a part of, in our reading, Burke described climate as perceptions that individuals have with regard to their local work unit and how they get along with their colleagues during day-to-day work on the job experience together with one another. Where culture is established in expectation, climate is far more subjective, and it's largely influenced by external events as well as interruptions. During the loss of this administrative Air Reserve technician, there were already significant events that were in play with our daily and monthly experience. First, ARTs have a statutory limitation during employment to organize training and equip reserve members. However, ARTs are highly skilled and qualified and frankly sought after. Their skill and their daily availability often make them targets of opportunity when their active duty airman counterparts are not available. This is an area of frequent conflict and misunderstanding. Additionally, the Budget Control Act of 2011 limited federal spending on defense, in particular discretionary accounts, including those related to operations and maintenance funds. Air Reserve technicians under the Air Force Reserve use some of those same accounts for their wages, so fund limitations can be daunting. Also, continuing resolution authorities have become an anticipated bridge for federal spending when budget bills do not get passed prior to the end of the fiscal year. Although federal spending does occur within continuing resolution authorities, it's typically well below anticipated funding levels, which creates some difficult decisions as we likely end up reducing our capability and capacity for training. And finally, as already mentioned, ARTs wear the military uniform, which is a significant cultural artifact that conveys a lot of military information. While ARTs observe military customs, they have distinct cultural norms that are often overshadowed because of the uniform. Limitations in civilian employee development, changes in positional assignment and wages, usually below their military pay with regard to counterparts, are some of the widely held observations we have within the Air Reserve technician workforce. During the pre-launch phase of the change management effort, I knew early on that Tishy's TPC levers would be particularly useful, not only because both of the supervisors in the two squadrons I was working with were fans of Jack Walsh. There was also a desire to emphasize the Air Reserve technician system and what we could do with our employees that I feel that we couldn't have done with traditional airmen in a military sense. So I elected to use the technical, political, and cultural levers specific to the Air Reserve system to help guide some of the planning aspects and concerns early on. The external interface clearly outside influence and inputs. Mission as far as shared objectives and pursuits, our desire to maintain success without fall off of capability and services. The strategy, which is the criteria for mission effectiveness, which I'll get into a little bit further with timelines and communication. Managing organizational mission and strategy process is a commitment to production through resource distribution, and in this case, role distribution. Task is employing technologies during performance, which included members that weren't familiar with some of these human resource roles and them gaining database access, which is typically very restrictive for somebody not normally assigned to perform that work. The described networks, which are formal connections of people through structural linkages. I'll describe that a little bit later in what are called memorandums of agreement. Organizational processes, which are methods in which work is directed. We sought to create a horizontal structure that entailed a lot of trust from the decision makers as we departed from the traditional hierarchical system, but I was able to state the need and that I needed trust in return. Finally, people, their characteristics, behaviors, and motivations, which I was able to take quick inventory, along with the emergent networks of informal connection of individuals through their workplace experiences. Although many of us were unfamiliar with some of these functions, we may have had already established relationships with those that know this work and know this role. So that was also part of the inventory. TPC has proven to be a very effective model as far as helping leaders identify the talents within their team, and it also takes them away from some of the emotional concerns they might have with the uncertainty, as supervisors and commanders are typically more closely associated with their organization's performance to their leadership ability. As it came time to determine an appropriate methodology for this organizational change effort, I knew I needed something that emphasized adaptability and performance value. In recalling our earlier reading from Cotter and Haskert and how they learned to describe adaptive organizations and whether or not it was desirable, it was stated that most successful organizations grow in some arrangements to produce implicit and explicit forms of conduct that affect employees increasing as their commitments span years and even decades. These norms become familiar, that they eventually are ingrained in the mindset of those employed. This is not a destructive problem, nor is it a particular opportunity, but it is an occurrence that makes organizational change difficult. Fortunately, I've got a younger workforce, and as Air Reserve technicians, I found that as change occurs fairly often, our position is individually or collectively, we're typically not anchored to any one process. We're outcome focused, we're task focused, and I think that's pretty healthy, but also that ensures an element of adaptability. Also in our earlier reading, while covering the history and background of Burke-Letwin's model, I noted that their work demonstrated a positive impact on climate through motivation and its relation to performance. Certainly, the participation influences productivity, but motivation really is the key and can be the mediating variable between some of the studies that we have, but also the practical day-to-day effort. You can read motivation fairly well, and you can see job satisfaction. So it's important from a supervisor's perspective that motivation, tasking requirements, skills and abilities, and certainly individual needs and values are all maintained in equal light. So with this perspective, considering motivation as an intervening category, I found that the relationship between climate participation performance was key and could be conveyed to decision makers and employees throughout this experience. As far as communicating task roles and responsibilities, I let everybody know that I was available, and I would certainly address their concerns early on. But really what happened is my availability became more of a channel for these air reserve technicians to identify efficiencies. I quickly learned that they weren't going to ask me to provide them any more information. They just wanted to know what steps could be removed and who could they go see if certain steps could be omitted in the interest of efficiency. And I was very impressed by that, and that was not anticipated. Additionally, the individual needs and values. I spent some time with some of the other supervisors because the additional workload and responsibilities as far as their transactional value, the transactions of day-to-day work, were going to increase fairly significantly. We needed to take note of that. As an air reserve technician, we have the ability to incentivize good performance. We don't necessarily need just to wait for an annual performance review for a monetary reward, but we can give time off awards that may result in a day or maybe two to recognize good performance, and those can be processed very easily. So there's the reward system utility. And then again, the motivation. I'm not worried about the culture of the Air Reserve Technician system. We're a small band of employees that work very closely together. If we keep an eye on one another and we monitor and distribute tasks appropriately, then we can probably gauge participation and morale fairly easily, and understand the need to maintain motivation as we work through this challenging time. So, whereas I had been maybe more skeptical in determining some of the external impacts that were affecting the climate of the organization, when it came time to describe the pre-launch aspects of the change effort, it was time to kind of emphasize the positive. So within the model, specific to the external environment, there are significant changes that are getting ready to occur within the Air Force. And with some new leadership, particularly our Chief of Staff of the Air Force, who's already signaled the need for squadron empowerment, which is bottom-up empowerment. That's a really significant shift that's very important. Empowering airmen at the lowest level to perform their missions by minimizing distractions. This is something I think everybody can get their mind around. And additionally, reducing some of the ancillary training requirements, those things that kind of round out our experience, but maybe aren't technically the most important, certainly are an aspect of change that many of us that have been in the military service are welcome. How this affects our organization and the segments affected. Although we're a bureaucracy, we're a small bureaucracy, and well, change may come slowly because specialized roles and responsibilities are understood. Because of our size, we can make change and adapt faster than larger ones. So what's fortunate is we go through absorbing the loss of this Air Reserve Technician human resource specialist. In short order, we've already assumed those responsibilities, and now we're describing to our echelons higher above how we might be able to make some improvements now that we've determined how best to conduct our work at the squadron level. With regard to mission and strategy, the Berkeley model reminds us that significant redirection of mission and purpose at earliest indication of external transient is fundamental. And although we knew this change was coming for a long time, there were significant external factors that were in play, and also some internal influences that needed to be mitigated through just good communication and allowing some of our Air Reserve technicians to perform these new roles with some trust and latitude. The change opportunity thusly was that our change agents were identified, and these folks had the personalities to create some relationships and bonds with some new people that we don't typically work with. while also building alliances through a formal process we call Memorandum of Agreement. Simply put, these MOAs are describing what functions and capability we have and how we'd like to perform them, and to our stakeholders, they describe what they're capable of doing and how they'd like to do their work, and then we just come to a overlapping agreement, and thusly we have an MOA. The organization segment affected, key here is that while one administrative position was lost, that one position had 14 functions that needed to be distributed and maintained. As those additional functions were distributed, we identified our 14 Air Reserve technicians as then coordinators who would assume these roles as additional duties. And they knew as well as I did that because we're talking about pay and promotion and how important that is to morale, I don't think anybody would argue. They realized early that we could not have any fall off of performance, so they were willing to get into these new roles and responsibilities on a near vertical learning curve and maintain a quality of service that had already existed and which we did accomplish. Again, with regard to mission strategy, the Burke-Littman model reminds us that the segment affected in this step, in this characteristic, is maintaining information flow to decision makers and senior officials. As they were aware we were getting ready to make some changes, they were certainly in tune with maintaining performance. So I realized pretty early on I owed them some type of timeline to ensure that we were managing the transition and that we had some waypoints along the way that we could measure and use as communication waypoints. So inventory began early on in the summer, and then we built our team. We transitioned to some new support organizations, and I still have some hiring that I'm in the midst of performing. That likely won't be completed until early next calendar year, but you'll notice between now and that hiring completion time of January 17, we're likely going to be in the midst of a continuing resolution authority. So it's an external factor, but we've identified it, and as long as it's been identified, I think we can certainly work around it, and as long as that information is conveyed to senior leaders now, they're not going to be surprised by it if there's impacts later down the road. So again, with mission and strategy, the key component is just good, sound communication. Another key part of the communication for the decision makers as well as the teams that were working through this change with me is to convey some of the strengths and weaknesses within the plan and some of the internal and external factors. Certainly a SWOT analysis is viable in certain instances, but I typically find, because I have a strong analytic team and our decision makers are frequently asked to make complex decisions, and that SWOTs have become somewhat of a misnomer and a challenge, because I typically find those that are being briefed kind of focus in on the weaknesses. The reality is that what change had been directed as far as the loss of this personnel, this administrative person, and the need to build alliances could not be avoided. So I shifted from a SWOT premise to what I call a mission model canvas. And this template is used a lot with academics and engineering when fielding acquisition processes. And so bringing complex systems and planning to light with people with pretty diverse backgrounds has proven to be very helpful, and in many ways it is already indicative of momentum. So I usually don't have to detail too many weaknesses in the study, but the strengths and opportunities become the primary focus. So key partners are just some of the organizations that we're working with. My key activities was to get agreements from both of the senior leaders within the two squadrons, my squadron, my commander, supervisor, and our our sister squadron as well, which I was able to accomplish early on. And then we're talking about key activities and primarily systems access. As I mentioned, the value proposition, we were coming out of the hierarchical and at least blending it into a horizontal collegial system, and that improved the sender-receiver feedback loop, as I mentioned. I got buy-in support from our leadership, which is one echelon above the squadrons early on, and I also began detailing maybe in the future how to replace some of the Air Reserve technicians that we lost through a programmatic process. And then some of the beneficiaries. Our focus has always been on our squadron members, but also I think this change improves our communication flow to our higher-ups, and it allows the Air Force Reserve to reallocate their manpower. So this mission model canvas was the product I used in lieu of a SWOT brief, and it's proven to be fairly effective. In terms of individual and organizational performance, the change opportunity created here was to strive to create a horizontal system and to decentralize administrative tasks through all of our coordinators. Additionally, the segment affected as these administrative functions went out to their coordinators is that usually the specialization that occurs time and schooling became on-the-job training, and we could get that accomplished in relatively short order. We had some folks come out to our organization to provide that training, but rather than send people off to the schoolhouse, where significant travel resources come into play, we had trainers come to us, and I can tell you that saved us a lot of time and frustration, but it certainly enabled us to establish a high learning trajectory, and I think that was key in maintaining key functions and services to our airmen. The Burke-Letwin model with regard to organizational culture reminds us that norms of behavior need to be adaptive to mitigate entropy. Explicit and implicit expectations brought to light as long as there is ethical objectives worthy of executing certainly is key. Our services to our traditional airmen were at the forefront of these decisions, and all those that were involved realized that we needed to remain committed to our members. So the change opportunity was for us to create a collegial personal work relationship, not just within our organization, but our sister squadron during the change. And we were able to step away from more hierarchical, very specialized systems so that we can on-the-job train our coordinators to assume these new roles that were critical to our members and our sister squadrons members as well. The organization, the segment affected, look, the transformational change is best achieved when adopted holistically. So this was a top-to-bottom reform that occurred, and the goal was to maintain distributive and procedural justice with focus on citizenship behaviors that are indicative of motivation, which I'll describe here shortly. The Burke-Letwin model reminds us that adapting norms of behavior reduces entropy, and both implicit and explicit expectations need to be described going through change. And so one aspect of the model that I spent considerable time on was with the culture as we became more horizontal and less hierarchical. To be individually focused, I thought applying organizational justice and trying to reach improved citizenship behaviors was going to be fundamental. So distributively, I needed to be equitable as to what I was doing and who I was doing it with. Procedurally, I needed to be clear, available, and accurate on any and all information I provided. And that message had to be consistent all the way through, both workforce and through the supervisors, decision makers. And to know the difference between the interpersonal and informational, to treat employees with dignity, and to share relevant information with them when it became available. What I felt amplified this effort was to work with everybody when building their new relationships through underscoring their power currencies. And these are the skills that kind of amplify employee value with others. And these people became fairly recognizable for what they were getting ready to do and who they were getting ready to do it with, because they talked about resource control, because they talked about building Rolodex with others. They had strong communication skills and were able to convey technical knowledge in short order. So that was certainly some of the aspects of the power currencies that we asked for early on and emphasized. And when we have people from higher organizations coming into our organization to train us, I think that's indicative of somebody not just being valuable, but being valued. And so I thought that was very good and very key early on with our cultural steps taken. And as I described with the organizational citizenship behaviors, I find these to be very important, even though we have performance values within the Defense Civilian Intelligence Personnel System. One key cultural aspect to our individual squadron is as a sense of altruism, doing service for the right reasons, to share respect, and to be frankly kind, to have a consciousness about our actions and our decisions and how they may affect others before we make those decisions. Our civic virtue, both to one another and to our society overall. And competition can be less than productive. But if we have a good sportsmanship attitude, that competition may give way to helping others and not just helping ourselves get ahead. So I thought this was pretty fundamental, and I think it's been well received by all those involved. The leadership step of the model, it too is largely a communication effort. I found early on, as far as the change opportunity, as long as I'm communicating effectively with decision makers and supervisors, there is a reciprocal level of trust made available to the employees that are performing the coordinator roles. That was really, really important. I shared with them pretty early on that we're flattening the organization and making it more horizontal. It was not well received at first, but that's just because command and control is synonymous with military operations and conducting mission. Horizontal is not a core competency of military decision making, but again, sometimes the culture between the military and the Air Reserve Technician system collides. And in this case, the Air Reserve Technician system won. So we assumed more of a horizontal structure because we needed to, and we had the trust at hand to accomplish this work in teams. So that was really impressive and frankly enjoyable as we're well into the post-launch phase of this change effort. Our commitment to our airmen still remains fundamental, And our supervisors and action teams that were part of the decision-making process understand one another's perspectives, communicate those perspectives without creating conflict. But again, communication helps at all levels with leadership. First, want to say it's been a privilege to present to you the organizational change effort that I've been part of in utilizing the Burke-Litwin model of change, and it's been tremendously effective. From an employee standpoint, the focus has been on them, their performance, their commitment, as a way of gauging their behavior, their motivations, what's important to them. Without the model, I'm not convinced I would have been employee-centric, frankly. As typically we're a hierarchical system, I probably would have been more procedural. So I'm delighted to have used the system at a time when I really needed it. Additionally, this model has helped me communicate to the decision makers, commanders, and supervisors why structural changes were important through this transition and why doing status quo work was not going to be effective. I'm very grateful that the leadership aspect of the model helped me build trust at a time when it was absolutely critical. As far as the work at hand, still more is needed. Squadrons do well together in predictable work, but unpredictable work, unique work, still poses some competitive challenges. And as far as the supervisors and commanders, those involved in decision making, typically I find that these members are not always available at predictable times, either due to travel or to other scheduled activities. So getting in their decision cycles when a decision is needed, not just for one organization, but for two, is a challenge, but easily overcome in time. As far as the gains, I found that our squadron's Air Reserve technician workforce is well designed and ready for unique challenges. They can team well, they can adapt to new situations, and prefer collegial systems, frankly, as long as it entails empowered access to systems and latitude to perform what they need to get done. Finally, the MaxiFlex schedule that's available to our employees during their 40-hour work week allows them to come in when needed and to leave when the tasks are accomplished. This is a very employee-centric focus with the MaxiFlex schedules, and I think it's been well appreciated. And to be honest, the tasks that have been needed to be performed have typically come in before expected. So the MaxiFlex schedule has been very, very successful. That concludes my presentation for this semester's final research project. And again, my name is Thomas James. It's been a privilege to be with you, and I wish you all continued success.